Hey everybody, Michael Walsh here. So this is a video I'm filming in the aftermath of UFC 318, Holloway versus Poirier 3. So I'm making this in part as a follow-up to my own MMA GOAT list video I made last week, but also sort of in connection to a lot of conversations that are happening on MMA YouTube at the moment, because I made that GOAT list video in response to a bunch of other big channels making their own GOAT list videos. But those same channels have been talking about how they'll likely need to update their GOAT list videos pretty soon because the next several pay-per-views are going to have, consequences that might change the GOAT list order, change people's rankings. Some people were saying that before UFC 317, so it was like they were saying the Oliveira to Poirier fight, the Holloway Poirier 3 fight, and the upcoming Khamzat and Dricus fight could all impact the GOAT list, which makes sense to a degree. People, after the Oliveira win, people really skyrocketed how highly they ranked Ilia Topuria. I disagree with that. I discussed that in my previous video. People were looking at the Holloway-Poirier fight, saying, hey, if Poirier wins, that'll obviously affect his ranking. It might hurt Max's rankings, whatever. People are looking at the Dricus fight and saying, hey, if Dricus can beat Khamzat, some people already have Dricus in their top 20, top 15. People are talking about him being top 10, top 5 if he can beat Khamzat. I don't agree with that, but I think, that win would do wonders for his resume. But I think there's an angle to this fight that just happened, this Holloway-Poirier fight, that people are completely missing, and they're really missing it because Holloway won. So let me explain. Everyone going into this fight was worried for Max, in the sense that they were worried for his legacy, for what it would do to him if he were to be 0-3 against two separate opponents, because he's of course 0-3 against Volk, and he was 0-2 going into this fight with Poirier. What would it mean if he lost to Poirier again? What would it mean to have two guys just have a complete wash over him? It didn't end up happening because Holloway won, and he rightfully won. It was a competitive fight. It was closer than people are making it out to be, but it was still, people are debating whether Poirier won 1 round or 2 rounds. No one's debating if he won. But it was still close. Like Poirier still got his licks in. He still dropped Max. He still hurt Max many times. It was back and forth. Max, clearly won. But the problem is that fight didn't convince me that Max would ever beat a prime Poirier, because while Max is arguably a little bit past his prime as well, I've made that argument myself, Poirier is clearly much further past his prime. Poirier is already 36 years old. It was his retirement fight, of course, and I don't know, because for Max to fight an old retiring Poirier and now do it having fought at lightweight again, having put more muscle on, having had that performance against Gaethje, not having that excuse that I was just a fat featherweight when I fought Poirier the first time, not having that excuse this time, and fighting an old Poirier, he still made it quite close. That just didn't convince me that any version of Max could beat the version of Poirier that beat him in the second fight. And maybe he could, because that second fight was close. People remember it as just Poirier steamrolling him. And he steamrolled him in parts of the first 2 rounds, but the last 3 rounds were very close. And, Poirier stole rounds, like round 4, I believe it was, is the one where he lands the knee and just splits Max's face open. If he didn't land that knee, he might have lost that round, and who knows, could have lost the fight at that point. Still would have done the better work, done the more highlight-worthy damage, but he could have lost that fight. So, I'm not saying that it's impossible that if we took this version of Max or the version of Max that beat Gaethje and put him in against a prime Poirier that he couldn't win, I think it would be close either way. But I'd still give the edge to Poirier, I think. And while that doesn't hurt Max's legacy in quite the same way as it would if Poirier just won on Saturday, I still think that hurts Max's legacy. It changes how we maybe should think of Max as an all-time great. And by consequence, and this is to me the more interesting part, it also affects how I look at people who've beaten them. So specifically, it affects how I look at Alexander Volkanovski and Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, like I think most people, I rank both Khabib and Volk very highly, but I rank Volk higher. In my own list, I had Volk at number 2 all time, and I had Khabib at, I believe, number 8 or number 7. In hindsight, I feel like I'm closing that gap in my mind after this third fight between Holloway and Poirier. So, I've always been of the mind, you know, this isn't an original thought. I think I'm borrowing this phrasing from the Heavy Hands podcast, actually. But I've been of the mind that featherweight has been the GOAT division, in the sense that it's the division with all the GOATs. And by that, what I mean is, if you look at the featherweight champions in the UFC, there's been 4 of them, and 3 of them are all-time greats. You know, Jose Aldo, all-time great. Volk, all-time great. Max, all-time great. Even McGregor, who in a GOAT discussion is the worst of the 4, even he is, depending on who you ask, possibly top 20, maybe more like top 30 would be like where I would put him. But he's a genuinely great fighter. Like, that's, you know, for a division to have him as their worst champion really says something. And by comparison, like, we also have at lightweight what I've heard people call like the violence kings of lightweight. And that is a group of lightweights spanning what's kind of 2 eras, but, you know, they're 2 overlapping eras. And so those violence kings of lightweight include Eddie Alvarez, Michael Chandler, Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, Charles Oliveira. And all 5 of those guys have fought each other. You know, they haven't all fought each other, but they've, you know, most of them have fought they've all fought most of the other guys. And we've kind of seen who the best of that group is. We've seen that Oliveira is the best because he beat Poirier, Gaethje, and Chandler, never fought Alvarez. Most people, I think, would put Poirier at second best because he's one, you know, he lost to Oliveira, obviously. 1-1 with Gaethje, beat Chandler, beat Alvarez. Then people would put Gaethje third probably because he's 1-1 with Poirier. He lost to Alvarez, beat Chandler. And then most people would have Alvarez after that because he went 1-1 with Chandler, beat Gaethje, lost to Poirier. And then most people would put Chandler last because he went 1-1 with Alvarez and then lost to the other 3. And I think that's appropriate. I think there's some caveats involved that I'll kind of get into. But in any case, you have these 5 violence kings at lightweight. And most people look at them as fan favorites. You know, they're, you know, of those 5 people, there's a good chance one of them's your favorite fighter. And if they're not, they're amongst your favorite fighters. Many of the best fights of all time have been had between these guys. And there's not been a bad fight between them at all. However, as much as we all love those guys, most of us, I think, would hold them in a lower regard than the featherweight GOATs, you know, the champions that, you know, at featherweight who are amongst the GOATs. You know, if we were to make our lists, you know, pretty much everyone, you know, if you make a top 20 list, like, maybe Oliveira's on it, maybe Poirier's on it, but they're probably behind Holloway, they're probably behind Volkanovski. You know, they should be behind Jose Aldo. You would think. I mean, with today's new lists, maybe not. But in any case, you know, and then Chandler and Alvarez and Gaethje probably aren't on those lists at all. In any case, you know, fan favorite or not, and obviously Holloway, you know, puts on great fights. Volk has great fights. Aldo has great fights. They're action fighters themselves. But, you know, we kind of have the fan favorite violence kings over here and the GOATs over here at featherweight with a clear quality difference in terms of skill, or so it would seem. And this third fight with Holloway and Poirier is really forcing me to reconsider all that. Because let me think. So let me unpack it this way. I'm going to kind of table all that for a second. Table the violence kings, table the featherweight GOATs, you know, table that for a second, table Khabib for a second. let's talk about Max and Volk. Everyone considers Volk like a better fighter in terms of GOAT discussion. And that makes sense because Volk beat Max 3 times. He proved he was the better man. Now, Volk doesn't really have any success at lightweight. I think he fought at lightweight and even welterweight, I think, like very early in his regional career. But in his UFC career, his only fights at lightweight are losses to Makhachev. And the first fight was very close, and you could argue actually boosts his resume rather than hurts it, or rather than being neutral. However, he still never won at lightweight. Max, of course, beat Justin Gaethje, and Max has now beaten Dustin Poirier. So I would say Max has, like officially at least, had more success at lightweight. And at featherweight, you could argue that Max has the better resume at featherweight than Volk, save for Volk's 3 wins over Max. I think that's a very accurate statement because they've mostly just fought the same guys. They've both beaten Jose Aldo. Max beat him twice. They've both beaten Ortega. They've both beaten Rodriguez. They've both beaten Korean Zombie. And then there's a few guys that Volk has beaten that Max hasn't fought. So he beat Lopez, of course, and he beat like Chad Mendes in the come up, and Max never fought him. But Max has fought scores of people that Volk hasn't fought. Like Max beat Cub Swanson, he beat Ricardo Lamas, he beat Anthony Pettis, he beat Jeremy Stevens, he beat Frankie Edgar, he beat Arnold Allen, he beat Calvin Kattar. Like, these are all the guys that Volk never fought. And then the main other title wins, again, you know, Zombie, Yair Rodriguez, Ortega, Max beat them too. So really, Volk's resume, like, and particularly his resume as being superior to Holloway's resume hinges on the fact that he beat Holloway 3 times. And it's very analogous to the relationship that Fedor and Nogueira had back in the day. So there were people that argued that Nogueira actually had the stronger heavyweight resume than did Fedor, that he did more to clear out the division at the time than did Fedor. It was simply the fact that Fedor beat Nogueira twice and Nogueira never beat him that made Fedor the undisputed number 1 and Nogueira stuck in the number 2 spot. And there was some truth to that. It was a similar case where there were people that Fedor fought that Nogueira didn't. Like Fedor fought Mark Hunt. Fedor ended up fighting Andrei Arlovsky, who Nogueira never fought. He fought Randleman, who Nogueira never fought. However, Nogueira ended up fighting like Randy Couture, who Fedor didn't fight. He fought Fabricio Verdum back in Pride when he was a contender, and Fedor didn't fight him until later, and of course lost to him. He fought Josh Barnett twice, and Fedor never fought him. He fought Sergey Karatanov when he was a contender, and had beaten like Pedro Hizzo and guys like that. Rico Rodriguez, Nogueira beat, who was a UFC champion who came over, and Fedor never fought him either. So there was truth, although I think there was less truth to that example. There was less truth to the idea that Nogueira had done so much more work at heavyweight than Fedor, and it was merely that Fedor had those wins over him. I think there's more truth that Max has done better work at featherweight, beaten more good names, as in a higher number of good names, than has Volk. But Volk just has the luxury of having beaten Max 3 times, proving that he's, the better fighter. And there's no one on that list. There's no one on that list that Max beat that Volk didn't fight that we would pick over Volk. Like, no one's going to say, yeah, I really think Cub Swanson would have beaten Volk, and I really think Frankie Edgar at featherweight was going to beat Volk, and I really think, Calvin Kattar was going to beat Volk. Of course, we don't think that. So, I think it's appropriate that Volk is ranked ahead of Max, and I'm not changing that. However, I'm just pointing out that so much of Volk's status, so much of putting him, I put him at number 2, greatest of all time, so much of that is reliant on how impressive we think it is that he beat Max 3 times. Now, as we just, we all knew, and as the first chunk of the video discussed, Max was at the risk of also going 0-3 against Poirier. Sure, the conditions were different because most of us don't count that first fight very much because it was like Max's 5th fight or something. He was so green. It was before either of them had entered their prime. The second fight, they were both in their prime. And now this third fight, but Max, in the second fight, Max had the excuse that he hadn't acclimated to lightweight. Poirier is just the bigger man of the two. And then this third fight is weird because Poirier's old. So it's just not as neat of a trilogy as opposed to the Max Volk trilogy, which all happened during both of their primes, during, you know, their overlapping title reigns. However, we're still in a weird spot where Max has beaten Gaethje, and he beat him quite well. And he's competitive with Poirier, but maybe not as good as Poirier. You know, and that still looks good because Poirier went 1-1 with Gaethje. So you could still make the argument, even if Max is slightly worse opposite Poirier, that when you look at the three of them, Max, Gaethje, Poirier, Max looks the best of the three when comparing them, when you're comparing that trinity. However, where this hurts Max, especially when you consider how many great lightweights are just former featherweights. Poirier, former featherweight. Oliveira, former featherweight. Gaethje and Alvarez never fought at featherweight, but I reckon they could. Gaethje's a very small featherweight. There's others escaping my mind, but all that is to say, like, I don't think there's as sharp of a distinction between those weight classes when the guys are, if a guy has been able to make featherweight several times, and if another guy's a big featherweight, I think they're pretty just comparable people. I think you get disparities, like Volk is not a big featherweight, and Islam is a huge lightweight that could never make featherweight, so when Volk and Islam fought, there was like a more obvious weight class differential. But I feel like Max is basically a lightweight. Just like Poirier is basically a lightweight. Just like Oliveira and Dan Hooker are basically lightweights. Now, this causes a collision where I told you earlier, we've got the violence kings at lightweight, we've got the goats at featherweight, and this forces this collision where I'm like, is Max really just a violence king at lightweight who has been hanging out at featherweight his whole career? Yeah, I mean, like, it makes you wonder, like, because you have to ask, like, could a prime Dustin Poirier beat Jose Aldo in his prime? Like, could he beat the Jose Aldo Max beat? And there would be a bigger size differential because Jose ended up going down to bantamweight. But like, let's imagine in our mind's eye that there's less of a size gap, that Aldo's bigger or Poirier's smaller, however you like it. But they have their skills and their attributes. Could Poirier just beat Aldo twice? Maybe he could. I'm willing to entertain that. And I'm willing to entertain that Poirier and Gaethje and Oliveira could beat Ortega and could beat Kattar and could beat Arnold Allen, and could beat Yair Rodriguez and could beat Korean Zombie, could beat Ricardo Lamas, could beat and I know Lamas beat Oliveira, so don't bring that up. But in general, like, I'm not convinced that the violence kings at lightweight couldn't take out most of the guys at featherweight that Volk and Max took out. They didn't have the same win streaks and reign that Max ended up having in their own division at lightweight, and therefore aren't held as high in the GOAT discussions. But it's making you wonder, like, is Max just one of those guys, but at featherweight, who hung out at featherweight and is now at lightweight with them? And if Max is actually not like a top 10 GOAT like so many people rank him, and is instead basically just as good as Dustin Poirier, what does that mean as far as Khabib and Volkanovski? Because again, Volkanovski, so much of his resume is just, hey, I beat Max 3 times. And Max is like an all-time GOAT. Max is better than Jose Aldo. Look how insane that is. And it is insane. But if Poirier could maybe just do the same thing, If Poirier got to fight Max in his prime 3 times and not fight not be an old man in the third fight, could he have just done the same thing? It probably wouldn't be as decisive as that third Volkanovski fight was. And I'm not saying Volkanovski. I'm still believing that Volkanovski is the better fighter than Dustin Poirier. But all of a sudden, if Max is at least is in good company with, Oliveira and Poirier and Gaethje and Alvarez and Chandler, does that mean that Volk's resume looks worse? Because now what makes him the number 2 GOAT is basically just doing something Dustin Poirier could have done. And all of a sudden, does Khabib look better? Because Khabib didn't fight all of the Violence Kings. He never fought Oliveira. He never fought Chandler. He never fought Alvarez. But he did fight prime, like truly prime Poirier and Gaethje. And that gets interesting because, like I discussed in my, GOAT list video, and other people have discussed in their GOAT list videos, that we should be looking at, like, not just quality of wins, but wins over people in their prime. And I ranted in my GOAT list video that people don't understand how primes work and are treating wins as prime wins when they clearly are not. Khabib only has prime wins. Khabib beat, like everyone Khabib beat effectively, all the good names he beat were in their prime. Poirier, prime. Gaethje, prime. Conor, prime. Iaquinta, prime. Barboza, prime. Michael Johnson, prime. RDA, prime. Pat Healy, prime. Like, he doesn't have wins like Merab's win over Henry Cejudo or Islam's win over Dustin Poirier. Because while Oliveira kind of proved he's the king of the Violence Kings, even he's got a lot of post-prime wins. Tony Ferguson clearly past his prime. Even Justin Gaethje is a little dicey. Justin Gaethje was already like 33 when Oliveira beat him. Michael Chandler was past his prime. Michael Chandler gets way too much criticism. Yes, he fights like a fool, especially in this era of his career where he's clearly just trying to become a fan favorite by being an action fighter. But his skills and his career are underrated. And people need to realize he was past his prime when he came to the UFC. He was already 35 in the Dan Hooker fight. We saw him age out of his prime in Bellator. Like, if you followed his Bellator career, you saw him age out of his prime. Like, and you knew that when he came over. Like, it's too bad he's like already getting old and he's going to the UFC now instead of like 4 years ago. Chandler, people are dissing his grappling now. It's like, yeah, I mean, and it sounds like his training practices aren't the best as far as how he does his skills training only in camp and not out of camp, and does strength and conditioning out of camp, and yada, yada, yada. And people are looking at his fight with Patty and his fight with Oliveira and whatnot, questioning his wrestling skills, questioning his jiu-jitsu skills. But prime Michael Chandler was a great grappler. Prime Michael Chandler was like the star student of Neil Melanson. He had submission wins over Eddie Alvarez, over Rick Hahn, who was a judo Olympian, who was like 14-1 at the time, who was a big dude, had fought at welterweight. Chandler submitted him. He submitted Marcin Held. Like, and he had dominant top control decision wins over Yamauchi and Brent Primus, who are great grapplers and good submission threats. Like, Chandler had great grappling. That's why I liked his chances going into the first Oliveira fight, because I was like, yeah, Oliveira's not going to submit him. Like, Chandler's grappling is underrated. And that fight played out pretty nicely for Chandler. Like, Oliveira got on his back. Chandler did not get choked out. Chandler got on top, was willing to grapple, was willing to stay on top, landed good ground and pound, dropped Oliveira, ended up losing because he got dropped with a hook, not because of the grappling. And that was past prime Chandler. That was like a 35, 36-year-old Chandler. Like, people just don't realize. Like, I've heard him unfavorably compared to Dan Henderson and saying, oh, he's like Dan Henderson. He's just a wrestler with a right hand. It's like a better comparison would be to say that prime Chandler was like Uriah Faber with better top control. Like, that's a better comparison. And I'm not saying he's, God's gift to jiu-jitsu or something, or to submission grappling, But Chandler was very underrated. And Chandler was past his prime when Oliveira beat him. So Oliveira beat past prime Chandler, past prime Tony, starting to get past prime and possibly past prime Gaethje. Like, Oliveira's resume, you know, as far as prime wins, has some asterisks. So does Poirier's. I mean, Poirier, you know, when Poirier finally beat McGregor twice, McGregor, you know, he had that, like, he lost to Khabib, had like a 2-year layoff, fought Cerrone, came back, had the 2 fights with Poirier. Like, his life was already starting to fall apart, and all the you know, all the personal life McGregor stuff was starting to happen. Like, I don't think his heart was in the game anymore. Those are still great wins, but there's a difference between beating that McGregor and beating the McGregor Khabib beat. There's also, in Islam's career, I talked about this in my GOATless video, but like, he's beaten all kinds of past prime dudes, like Bobby Green, like Poirier, like the Volk in the rematch, like, you know, even Oliveira. Even the Oliveira win, you could argue pretty strongly that Oliveira was past his prime when Islam beat him. It's the same argument I made for why Oliveira was past his prime when Arman beat him. It's just, you adjust it by 1 year, you know, and like 1 fight. But it was still, Oliveira was 33 in the Islam fight. He'd had over 40 fights. He'd been knocked out or TKO'd like 4 or 5 times, been dropped and hurt in countless fights, you know, came up and shoot a box. Like, that's just not a prime dude. I know it was at the end of his win streak, but, you know, when Gaethje beat Ferguson, that was also at the end of his win streak. Like, that's, you know, sometimes people's win streaks get halted because they fight the better man, and sometimes it's because they're past their prime, and sometimes it's both. And I think in Islam's case, it's probably both. But as far as the quality of that win, you do need to factor in that Oliveira was probably slightly past it. Khabib, on the other hand, again, like I said, everyone he fought was in his prime. All the relevant names that he beat were in his prime. I'm not saying every guy in his record was, but all of the relevant names were prime wins. And where this connects to Volkanovski is that if Volk's, you know, resume is heavily dependent on these 3 wins over Holloway, and if Holloway is maybe just a violence king at lightweight who's been hanging out at featherweight, if Holloway is more on par with the Poiriers, the Oliveiras, the Gaethjes, and not way ahead of them, all of a sudden, you know, we have to compare, like, well, does beating Max 3 times in his prime, how much does that outweigh beating Conor in his prime, Poirier in his prime, and Gaethje in their prime? You know, I would say Max is probably better individually than all 3 of them, but Khabib should also get credit for the variety of opponent. It's not just fighting the same dude over and over again. And then everything else starts coming in, because now Khabib also gets to brag about the dominance. You know, I've never been cut, never been dropped, never lost. You know, I don't have... And Volk never lost in his prime, and never lost in his prime at featherweight. But nevertheless, he did lose at one point. And yes, Khabib has that close, controversial win over Tebow. But all of a sudden, you know, the quality of wins becomes very questionable. The gap in quality of wins, the superior quality of Volkanovski's wins over Khabib's wins become very questionable. And now the things that are undeniably in Khabib's favor, the dominance, the lack of damage taken, and so on, the undefeated record, all of a sudden that starts looking very good, you know, because it's undeniable, and now in tandem with the comparable quality of wins, all of a sudden Khabib is looking very good in the GOAT discussion. Now, with that all said, I would still put Volk ahead of him. It's more a question of, should Khabib climb the ranks a spot or 2? Should Islam go down a spot or 2? Which I think he should. Like, even since making that video, I thought, man, Fedor actually should be ahead of Islam. And should Volk, you know, drop down a few places? Should Volk still be number 2? You know, maybe Khabib goes up 1 and Volk goes down like 2 or something, and now they're like 2 spots away from each other. I'm not sure. But I think these are all realities that people are completely missing just because Max won.